Morning, everyone. Good to see you all here bright and early this Sunday morning. We're going to keep going through, I think this is lesson 7, some of the earlier kings of the southern kingdom. Last time we talked about, I think, Asa and Jehoshaphat for the most part, and both of those kings were pretty good overall. We read that Asa was described as wholly true to the Lord, and we had some kind of discussion about that being the case, even though he made a few mistakes in the later years of his life. And then we moved on to Jehoshaphat, and we saw one of the things he did. Not only was he personally righteous, but he also created infrastructure under him, reforming the judicial system and things like that, so that the common people under him would also have the means to be righteous and administer righteously in their own spheres. And so today we're going to start with King Jehoram, and this is kind of where the wheels start to fall off. So I hope you all enjoyed talking about good kings, because we're not going to talk very much about good kings today. So welcome to everyone here and everyone on the live stream as well. We're going to jump right in where we left off last time. To start off, does anyone want to read 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verses 1 through 10? That's 2 Chronicles 21 and the first 10 verses.
I looked down and saw all those names that I was going to have to go through. I second guess. All right. 2 Chronicles 21. 1 through 11?
1 through 10.
1 through 10. Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Jehoram, his son, reigned in his place. He had brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat: Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariah, Michael, Zephatiah. All these were the sons of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel. Their father gave them great gifts of silver, gold, and valuable possessions, together with fortified cities in Judah. But he gave the kingdom to Jehoram, because he was the firstborn. When Jehoram had ascended the throne of his father and was established, he killed all his brothers with the sword, and also some of the princes of Israel. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet the Lord was not willing to destroy the house of David, because of the covenant that he had made with David, and since he had promised to give a lamp to him and to his sons forever. In his days, Edom revolted from the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own. Then Jehoram passed over with his commanders and all his chariots, and he rose by night and struck the Edomites who had surrounded him and his chariot commanders. So Edom revolted, and the rule of Judah to this day. At that time, Libnah also revolted from his rule, because he had forsaken the Lord, the God of his fathers.
All right, thank you very much. One of the perks of being the teacher is you can make other people read all the hard names. So I appreciate David doing that. So Jehoram reigned 8 years, also called Joram elsewhere. He's described as he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And we had talked about this previously going through the northern kingdom. It says in verse 6, "And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife." So that word "for," there's kind of that causation that you see there, where it's one of the reasons at least that he did this is because he had a really bad marriage. And so that was a very bad influence on him. Walks in the ways of the kings of Israel, and he marries Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab specifically. That's in 2 Chronicles chapter 18 and verse 1. You might remember that chart that we had looked at a few weeks ago, where it kind of showed the intermarriage between the royal lines of Israel and Judah, and we're kind of right in there in that mess right now where they're intermarried, and this is a very bad thing for the southern kingdom. I think you had made the point, Aaron, where a really good king made a really bad decision in terms of family marriage, and we're going to see that has some really bad consequences moving forward. We see in verses 2 through 4, he takes the throne and he kills all his brothers. This isn't the only time that we see this happening, but it never really gets any less depressing when you see kings taking the throne and immediately doing this. So this is another bad reflection on Jehoram's character. And starting in verse 11, which we're going to read the rest of this here in a second, he starts leading Judah into idolatry. So does someone want to read 2 Chronicles chapter 21 and the next 10 verses, so verses 11 through 20? Ben?
11 through 20.
Yeah.
Moreover, he made high places in the hill country of Judah and led the inhabitants of Jerusalem into whoredom and made Judah go astray. And a letter came to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, because you have not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, or in the ways of Asa king of Judah, but have walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and have enticed Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem into whoredom, as the house of Ahab led Israel into whoredom, and also you have killed your brothers of your father's house, who are better than you. Behold, the Lord will bring a great plague on your people, your children, your wives, and all your possessions. And you yourself will have a severe sickness with the disease of your bowels, until your bowels come out because of the disease day by day. And the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the anger of the Philistines and of the Arabians who are near the Ethiopians. And they came up against Judah and invaded it and carried away all the possessions they found that belonged to the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that no son was left to him except Jehoahaz, his youngest son. And after all this, the Lord struck him in his bowels with an incurable disease. In the course of time, at the end of 2 years, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great agony. His people made no fire in his honor, like the fires made for his fathers. He was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he departed with no one's regret. They buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings.
All right. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next slide. So, as we just read, Jehoram's wickedness brings really bad consequences. For the southern kingdom, we read that Edom and Libnah start to revolt. And there's the note in, let me pull up the verse real quick. Oh, in verse 10 of 2 Chronicles 21, where it says, So Edom revolted from the rule of Judah to this day. So this wasn't just a short-lived thing going on of there was a short revolt and then it was put down. No, this was kind of a more lasting consequence. And then the Philistines and the Arabs near the Ethiopians. Aaron, did you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. You're ready. So obviously Edom's another country that they were controlling, but Libnah is a Judean city. It was a city where a bunch of priests lived. So that's the only time I can think of in this whole era where a city inside the kingdom revolts and says, no, you're not our king anymore. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty bad when one of your own cities revolts against you.
Yeah, that is a good point. Thank you. And it's interesting to see, one of the things we're going to keep seeing and that we've seen already is good kings get buried in the tombs of the kings. Bad kings usually don't. And so you can clearly tell what the people thought of the king by what happens right after they die. And I think that kind of ties into that. And so Philistines and Arabs near the Ethiopians invade and plunder. And in verses 16 and 17, we had read a few verses earlier that there was Elijah's judgment. I'm trying to find where it says, verse 14, Behold, the Lord will bring a great plague on your people, your children, your wives, and all your possessions. And in verse 16 and 17, we see the Philistines and the Arabians come up against Judah, and they invade and carried away all the possessions that belonged to the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that no son was left to him except Jehoahaz, his longest son. So the Philistines and the Arabs walk in and pretty much ransack the whole place. It's not a good picture. And so Elijah tells Jehoram of God's punishment. His family will be destroyed. That's what happens. He will die from bowel disease. And I'm not medically qualified to talk about this, but verse 19 tells us at the end of 2 years his bowels come out and he dies in great agony. I don't know what condition that is, but it's not a pleasant one. And clearly we're told that's God's punishment on Jehoram. One of the things I thought was interesting about Asa, as we read, I think it was in the 39th year of his reign, he got the foot disease that we talked about. I don't think we're specifically told if that was God's punishment on him or not, but here it's clear this is God's punishment on Jehoram for his wickedness. And sure enough, he dies from the bowel disease, dies in great agony with no honors. And this language, and I think it's in verse 20, in the middle of the verse where it says, "And he departed with no one's regret." Talk about things that I don't want to be remembered by. I do not want to be remembered as I departed with no one's regret. And then that's what it says there. That's kind of the last note that we get on him. And it says they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. And I think that has to do with him being wicked. Anyone have any thoughts, questions on Jehoram?
I like the Elijah letter. It just shows the boldness of Elijah. But when he's like, you haven't walked in the ways of your father who was good, and you killed your brothers who were better than you. That's smacking him around pretty good. I like that part.
Yeah, I do like that. We talked about the boldness as well. I think it was one of the military alliances between the northern and the southern kingdom where, I can't remember exactly which prophet it was, but he basically comes and says, if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even pay any attention to you guys, but bring me a musician because Jehoshaphat is here. So these prophets are definitely going and telling them what God has instructed them to say. Anything else before we move on to the next lesson? All right.
Oh, Gary.
In Jeremiah 22:18, it also says, "Therefore thus says the Lord concerning Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, the king of Judah, they shall not lament for him, saying, Ah, my brother, or Ah, sister. They shall not lament for him, saying, O Lord, O Ah, his majesty. With the burial of a donkey he shall be buried."
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that guy.
Again, ways that you don't want to be remembered. So, moral of the story, don't be wicked. Let's, someone want to pull up lesson 8 real quick? I guess I can do it if no one else does, but it's the PowerPoint in the top right corner of the desktop. All right, thank you, Mark. So moving on, more of the kings of Judah in lesson 8. This will be from Ahaziah to Ahaz, and this is that picture of the men's side of the tomb of David that we had seen previously at the beginning of lesson 7. I think according to Google Translate it says, "And there was David in the flesh." That was what I think Mark found. So interesting picture. So Ahaziah, starting in 2 Chronicles chapter 22. Does anyone want to read verses 1 through 9 of 2 Chronicles 22? First 9 verses? David?
And the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place, for the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done. For after the death of his father, they were his counselors to his undoing. He even followed their counsel and went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, to make war against Hazael, king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead. And the Syrians wounded Joram, and he returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds that he had received at Ramah when he fought against Hazael, king of Syria. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel, because he was wounded. But it was ordained by God that the downfall of Ahaziah should come about through going to visit Joram. For when he came there, he went out with Jehoram to meet Jehu, the son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. And when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he met the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers, who attended Ahaziah, and he killed them. He searched for Ahaziah, and he was captured while hiding in Samaria, and he was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said, "He is the grandson of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart." And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom.
All right. Thank you very much. So that's our account of Ahaziah, youngest son of Jehoram. Ephraim. Mike is coming.
This is not necessarily a question to you, but it's a question to anybody that might be able to give some insight. We understand, starting in the New Testament, for some of us who really had no familiarity with a lot of the Old Testament when we obeyed the gospel, but we did see examples and explicit statements of the importance of teaching your children about God, His Word. Are any of these individuals, is there any indications anywhere in these books that we're looking at in the Old Testament where these people had been being taught by their parents?
From my experience going through this, I haven't seen a whole lot of it necessarily. If anyone wants to offer thoughts on that, definitely open.
We at least see influence, especially upcoming. There is a priest involved who raises the king, and we see that he remains good while that priest is alive. So I think that's the influence. And
You're talking about the 8-year-old?
yes, but I think it's an inference, but it never comes out and says, Jehoshaphat sat down and explained the way to him. And we've seen before when was that Jehoshaphat when he set up all the judges and the priest came and taught the law. I've been moving back and forth in all these lessons. I can't remember who's who right now. So I think that's it, but nothing specific about a father and son passing the word on that I have noticed yet.
I would understand that the accounts of Kings and Chronicles they're written from a political perspective, primarily political and spiritual, but they're not, even though it's father to son, it's not really written on a family level, so they don't get into the details of did Jehoshaphat try to teach his son or not. It doesn't address that one way or the other, but it's certainly interesting to me how you can have wicked sons from righteous fathers and the reverse, or you can have righteous sons from righteous fathers. It shows that every person has to make their own decision whether they were taught properly or not. That's the bigger lesson I get out of it. But I wanted the same thing, Ephraim, I guess.
I also think it's interesting, even going all the way back to David in the United Kingdom. I'm quoting Aaron again. He would not win the Father of the Year award in some ways. And so I think that may kind of be carrying down a little bit. David didn't necessarily get it always right. And I think these fathers, they probably got some things right, and they probably didn't get other things right, but we're not necessarily told all the details on that. Anyone else want to comment on that before we move on? All right, so we read about Ahaziah. Like we said, he was the youngest son of Jehoram. And one of the things I think is interesting, usually when we see kings who are named by two different names, the names are at least pretty similar. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 17, it said, "No son was left to Jehoram except Jehoahaz, his youngest son." So there's the name Jehoahaz. And then you get down to chapter 22 and verse 1, and all of a sudden it talks about Ahaziah, which Jehoahaz and Ahaziah are not similar names to my understanding, but they both describe Jehoahaz or Ahaziah as Jehoram's youngest son. So I think that's part of the... Yeah, Aaron.
Sorry to keep talking. It's actually the identical name. So Ahaz is the name. You take IH That's just the abbreviation for Yahweh.
Okay.
You stick it at the front, it's Jehoahaz. You stick it at the end, it's Ahaziah. It's the identical name in Hebrew.
Okay. That's interesting because it's the same name in Hebrew, but as someone who doesn't know Hebrew, I look at those names and I think, these are two totally different names. But that's a good point. And I think that's something that people in that day would have understood a lot more easily than, 21st century Texan hillbilly. So, thanks, Aaron. So, Ahaziah, 22 years old, reigned for 1 year, grandson of Ahab and also Jehoshaphat. So I was kind of thinking a little bit about, let me pull up the passage just to make sure I get it right. I think it's 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18. That's kind of the part about, when Paul's writing about what fellowship has light with darkness, what accord has Christ with Belial. And I was just thinking about that a little bit here because on the one hand, grandson of Jehoshaphat, really good king, and then also grandson of Ahab, who's the opposite of that. And so I think that's just, we're seeing those consequences already coming down more and more. Called Jehoahaz also, and that's that reference to 2 Chronicles 21, verse 17. And he's described in verses 3 and 4 as he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and that's probably because of Athaliah's influence. And we're gonna unfortunately see more of Athaliah here in a moment, but she's already kind of playing a role in here right off the bat. And we read about this previously when we went through the northern kingdom about how Ahaziah allied himself with the northern king at the time, and that was when Jehu was called by God, you're going to go bring my judgment on the house of Ahab, and Ahaziah, unfortunately for him, gets caught up in that. And he is part of the house of Ahab due to that marriage relationship. Fulfills the prophecy of Elijah back in 1 Kings chapter 21. That's something we talked about a few lessons ago. And I love the burial description of Ahaziah. Verse 9, it says, "They, the people, buried him, for they said, he is the grandson of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart." So nobody really wants to talk about Ahaziah, but his grandpa, he was really good, so we'll give him a burial. Did anyone have any thoughts, comments on Ahaziah before we moved on? All right, let's move on to Queen Athaliah. Now, this is interesting to me. The Bible kind of gives us a little bit of foreshadowing. At the end of verse 9, the last sentence says, "And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom." So there's a little bit of fertile ground here for a bad person to do bad things, if you will. And does someone want to read 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 10 through 12? Mark, you want to read it?
Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. But Jehoshabeth, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were about to be put to death. And she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus Jehoshabeth, the daughter of King Jehoram and wife of Jehoiada the priest, because she was a sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah, so that she did not put him to death. And he remained with them 6 years, hidden in the house of God, while Athaliah reigned over the land.
All right. Thank you very much. So Athaliah kind of comes in and she decides, I'm going to take out the whole royal family because I want to be queen. And there's an interesting quote from a commentator that Mark may have found, or Mark may have taken from Aaron. I don't necessarily know who found it, but this is from David Guzik, and he says, "Athaliah was from the family of Ahab, and Jehu had completely destroyed all of Ahab's descendants in Israel. Now, after Jehu's coup, Athaliah tried to save something for Ahab's family by trying to eliminate the house of David in Judah." So that might be an explanation for why Athaliah is basically stepping in and taking out her own family. And I just think that's a really interesting thing to think about. So mother of Ahaziah, daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, just kind of the background of Queen Athaliah here, kills all the remaining heirs to the throne, except we read that Joash was saved by Jehoshabeth. And she was the daughter of King Jehoram and wife of priest Jehoiada. And there's another commentator, Adam Clark, who indicates it's not likely that Jehosheba was the daughter of Athaliah. She was a sister, we find, Ahaziah, the son of Athaliah, but probably by a different mother. So just kind of trying to work through all the family power dynamics here. This does not come naturally to me, so this is something I really struggle with, but it's just interesting to think about, how are the family relationships playing in here? Athaliah is killing her own family, but then Jehoshabeth, who's also related, comes in and steals away one of the royal sons to prevent him from getting killed. It must have been a fascinating thing to watch. So let's read.
Before we go, that just was baffling me, all the names, and I was like, hang on, how is she related? That's why I threw that in there, because there's so many names and there's not a family tree there that it's just, to your point, it's wild that this is the line for Jehoshabeth, that it seems like she is from the north as well, but she's like, this is the line, she's reached cartoonish villainy here.
For sure. And so one of the things I wanted to point out with no details recorded about Queen Athaliah before we read the next part of the account, for almost every other king that we've looked at so far, there's kind of an opening statement such as, this king was X years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for Y years, and he was wicked or he was a good king. And then they'll say something at the end about the king's burial and the next person who reigned after him. But I think it's really interesting that Athaliah doesn't get that. And so I think one of the points we should take from that is God is not viewing Athaliah as a legitimate ruler. There's not a statement of, she's the queen, she reigned this long, and she was, obviously she was wicked, but she's not getting treated in the account the same way as all the kings do. And I think part of that is because, frankly, she's not supposed to be here, but she's kind of taken it for herself.
One thing I was thinking about was when it talked about no one from the house of Ahaziah had the strength to rule his kingdom. That's because Joash was a baby. I mean, because he was 7 when he started to reign, and that was as long as, he had been hidden 6 years or whatever. So he couldn't be placed on the throne because he wasn't old enough, and so that's why they had to hide him in the temple until he was old enough. And then his mother, we're about to read that about making the decision. I mean, I'm sure that was a crucial point there to make the decision. Okay, how old does he need to be until he would be accepted as the king?
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. Ephraim?
And to that point, when we see the chaos that's going on in the world in this time period, and we see the chaos that's going on now in the 21st century with us, we know above all of this that God is still in control, and he's going to make a path through all of this chaos so that his plan will go on.
That's right. Even though it's hard for us to see sometimes, or maybe at least hard for me to see. Maybe it's easier as you get older and more experienced, but I kind of look at all this and I think, what in the world is going on?
Amen.
But God's got a plan. Aaron, did you?
I gotta raise that high.
Yeah, Jehoshaphat, it's amazing. It's the line of David, the future of the Messiah coming, has at this point come down to one person. There's no one else alive with royal blood of David except for this baby.
Yep.
And his aunt Jehoshaphat saves him and puts him in the one place that she knew Athaliah would never look, the temple.
Right.
Which is almost amusing to me that, it wouldn't even occur to her to go into there. So he's able to hide there until he's older. But I'm just amazed that at her courage and seeing what's unfolding here, seeing Athaliah murdering her own grandkids, and she steps up and it's through her that we have everything that comes after in terms of the royal line.
That's right. And just one generation up from there, when the Philistines and the Arabs came and destroyed, I think, Jehoram's whole family, except for the youngest son, Ahaziah, well, there's one left again. But God had promised this line is going to keep going, and sure enough, we see that it did.
And God is not slack concerning his promises.
Amen. That's right. So Queen Athaliah is killed in a coup led by High Priest Jehoiada. Does anyone want to read this account? 2 Chronicles chapter 23, verses 1 through 15, first 15 verses. Okay.
Then in the 7th year, Jehoiada summoned his courage and took the commands of hundreds into a covenant with him. Azariah, son of Jehoram, Ishmael, son of Jehohanan, Azariah, son of Obed, Maziah, son of Adiah, and Elishaphat, son of Zichri, and they made a circuit through Judah. They gathered the Levites from all the cities of Judah and the family heads of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. Then the whole assembly made a covenant with the king in God's temple. Jehoiada said to them, "Here is the king's son. He will reign just as the Lord promised concerning David's sons. This is what you are to do. A third of you, priests and Levites who are coming on duty on the Sabbath, are to be gatekeepers. A third are to be at the king's palace, and a third are to be at the foundation gate. And all the troops will be in the courtyards of the Lord's temple. No one is to enter the Lord's temple but the priest and those Levites who serve. They may enter because they are holy, but all the people are to obey the requirement of the Lord. The Levites are to completely surround the king with weapons in hand. Anyone who enters the temple is to be put to death. Accompany the king in all his daily tasks." So the commanders of hundreds did everything the priest Jehoiada commanded. They each brought their men, those coming on duty on the Sabbath and those going off duty on the Sabbath. For the priest Jehoiada did not release the divisions. The priest Jehoiada gave to the commanders the hundreds King David's spears, shields, and quivers that were in God's temple. Then he stationed all the troops with their weapons in hand, surrounding the king from the right side of the temple to the left side, by the altar and by the temple. They brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, gave him the testimony, and made him king. Jehoiada and his sons anointed him and cried, "Long live the king." When Athaliah heard the noise from the troops, the guards, and those praising the king, she went to the troops in the Lord's temple. As she looked, there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance. The commanders and the trumpeters were by the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets, while the singers with musical instruments were leading the praise. Athaliah tore her clothes and screamed, "Treason, treason!" Then the priest Jehoiada sent out the commanders of hundreds, those in charge of the army, saying, "Take her out between the ranks and put anyone who follows her to death by the sword." For the priest had said, "Don't put her to death in the Lord's temple." So they arrested her, and she went by the entrance of the horse gate to the king's palace, where they put her to death.
All right. Thank you very much. This is not the most important point, but in verse 13, Athaliah crying, "Treason, treason." Of all the people qualified to complain about treason, I feel like she's got to be pretty far down on the list. So I just think that's really interesting. And so Joash is anointed king, and everyone's celebrating. Athaliah is drawn to the temple, and they didn't want to put her to death in the Lord's house, and so they bring her out to the horse gate of the king's house and put her to death. And that's what those last few verses were about. And we really don't get that much else about her. She's just kills everyone. She's wicked. She reigns 6 years, and then they put Joash on the throne and they dispose of her. And so this last note here, this has already been mentioned. At this point, Joash is 7. He's not old enough to independently act as a king, and so Jehoiada is going to kind of call the shots for a while. And we see in 2 Chronicles 23, verses 16 through 21, Jehoiada makes some reforms to follow the law. Does anyone want to read those verses for us? Not as long as the last segment, I promise.
And Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people of the king and they should be the Lord's people. Then all the people went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke in pieces, and they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And Jehoiada posted watchmen for the house of the Lord under the direction of the Levitical priests, and the Levites whom David had organized to be in charge of the house of the Lord, to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and with singing, according to the order of David. He stationed the gatekeepers at the gates of the house of the Lord, so that no one should enter who was in any way unclean. And he took the captains, the nobles, the governors of the people, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, marching through the upper gate to the king's house. And they set the king on the royal throne. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword.
All right, thank you very much. So Jehoiada comes in, and it says all the people in verse 17 went to the house of Baal, tore it down, broke the altars and the images, killed the priest of Baal, posted watchmen for the house of the Lord. So Jehoiada is kind of coming in here and cleaning up the mess that I think Athaliah had made, and probably some of the wicked kings before her had probably allowed these things to happen as well. So Jehoiada says, no, we're gonna get this back in order and try to follow God. Any thoughts on Athaliah before we move on?
I mean, seeing here what happens with Jehoiada, I think it emphasizes the importance of the leadership to the country, and kind of as goes the leaders, so goes the country. And I understand each person has their own individual responsibility, but God puts a great emphasis, I think, on leadership and the importance of leaderships and the kind of the responsibility they bear, because, you know, if they're building an altar to the Baal, the people are going to be there worshiping. You tear it down, you put peace in the land, then they're going to be more likely, you know, to follow God.
Right. And that's one of the unfortunate things we're going to see with Joash. I think Mark had already brought this up. You know, we're going to read that Joash was a righteous king all the days of Jehoiada. And then the implication from that is, well, what happens after Jehoiada dies? And we're going to see things go not so well for Joash after that point.
And to that point, and to Elisa's point, I think it's wild that we see, not even within generations, but lifetimes, this polar swings back and forth, and it just reiterates how important it is to study and know God's word. Like we see that when the priest comes and teaches the law, everybody's cool. When they go and forget the law and be like, well, we'll get to that when we get to that, everything is bad.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So Joash, what time is it? We've got time to read this. So I wanted to read the first 16 verses of 2 Chronicles 24. This is a long reading, so I'll do it myself. And we're going to read about some of the earlier parts of Joash's life here. So 2 Chronicles chapter 24, starting in verse 1. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. After this, Joash decided to restore the house of the Lord. And he gathered the priests and the Levites and said to them, "Go out to the cities of Judah and gather from all Israel money to repair the house of your God from year to year, and see that you act quickly." But the Levites did not act quickly. So the king summoned Jehoiada the chief and said to him, "Why have you not required the Levites to bring in from Judah and Jerusalem the tax levied by Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the congregation of Israel for the tent of testimony? For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house of God and had also used all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord for the Baals." So the king commanded, and they made a chest and set it outside the gate of the house of the Lord. And proclamation was made throughout Judah and Jerusalem to bring in for the Lord the tax that Moses, the servant of God, laid on Israel in the wilderness. And all the princes and all the people rejoiced and brought their tax and dropped it into the chest until they had finished. And whenever the chest was brought to the king's officers by the Levites, when they saw that there was much money in it, the king's secretary and the officer of the chief priest would come and empty the chest and take it and return it to its place. Thus they did day after day and collected money in abundance. And the king and Jehoiada gave it to those who had charge of the work of the house of the Lord, and they hired masons and carpenters to restore the house of the Lord, and also workers in irons and bronze to repair the house of the Lord. So those who were engaged in the work labored, and the repairing went forward in their hands, and they restored the house of God to its proper condition and strengthened it. And when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and with it were made utensils for the house of the Lord, both for the service and for the burnt offerings, and dishes for incense and vessels of gold and silver. And they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord regularly all the days of Jehoiada. But Jehoiada grew old and full of days and died. He was 130 years old at his death. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel and toward God and his house. And so this is the account of Joash through Jehoiada's death. Things are by and large pretty good. King at 7 years old, reigns for 40 years, also called Jehoash, and that's in 2 Kings chapter 12 and verse 2. His mother was Zibiah of Beersheba, and I just thought this was an interesting note because, to my knowledge, we don't have any other information on Zibiah of Beersheba. I guess that she would have been a wife of Ahaziah, presumably, but maybe a positive indicator that the mom wasn't of Ahab's lineage. I don't know that, but there's potential for a less wicked mom in place, for whatever that means. Did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada. And so I want to flag this because this is kind of a conditional statement of righteousness. You know, most of the time previously we've had, this king did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, or this king was wicked and followed after the Baals. But here we've got a statement of this king was righteous, but there's a catch. And we're going to see that catch reveal itself in the next part of the chapter. But Joash does what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada. He reinstates the temple tax that we read about and repairs and restores the temple. I think the key part to note on repairing the temple is in verse 7, where it says, "For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman had broken into the house of God and used all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord for the Baals." And so this Joash's repairs and restores are in part to fix that mess and make things right again. Did anyone have any thoughts, questions on this slide before we move on? Aaron?
Another detail that would be obvious to the people at the time that just goes right past us. Jehoiada lives to be 130. We think, people in the Old Testament live longer. In the whole area of the kings, David dies at 70 as an old, decrepit man. I might be wrong. I can't think of any king that lives that long. So the fact that, if my math's right, he would have been 84 when Joash is rescued as a baby. And then he's going to die at 130. That's a blatant miracle to everyone at the time that this elder statesman of a high priest just keeps going. And I think you see God's hand that he's living to help this young king who can't stand on his own to learn the ways. But again, that would have been obvious to them. And I didn't get that until I had studied this many, many times.
And that was actually, you kind of stole my point. I was going to bring that up, but you said it better, so don't worry about it. I think it is really interesting that, he lives to 130 years old, right? We're way past the era of the Old Testament when people were living well into triple digits. That's not what we see anymore. And yet Jehoiada lives to 130. And I agree with you. I think that's clearly God's hand in that, blessing him. And just out of curiosity for myself, I did a search for the list of oldest known people whose ages have been verified. And at least the list on Wikipedia, the oldest verified person had lived to 122 years and 164 days. And that was a French woman who lived from February 1875 to August 1997. And yet Jehoiada lives longer than that. And so I think that is really interesting to note and definitely would have been obvious to the people at the time. I should pull up my points. And one other thing I think is interesting is Jehoiada is not a king, but we read in verse 16, and they buried him in the city of David among the kings. And so people were so impressed with Jehoiada that they gave him basically a royal burial here. And that's a big statement as to what people thought of him. Any other thoughts, questions on this slide? I think the first bell is going to ring here in a second. So let's see what the next reading is and if we have time for it.
Quick point, since you mentioned the bell about to ring, maybe you don't want to keep going, but this will probably come up a little bit later as you talk about what happens after this, but it makes me wonder, or it makes me think about, I guess, when you think about parents and children, you think about Jehoiada and Joash, and while he's there, he's doing a lot of good things, and maybe he's helping Joash do a lot of good things. Similarly, like when children are at home and you're helping them do what's right, and you're doing hopefully what's right. But it makes me wonder, I mean, nothing is said negatively here about him, but it makes me wonder how well he taught Joash to continue on after him, or did he simply kind of do, and maybe, although he was a good example, maybe he didn't do as much teaching and leading of Joash to become who he needed to be, or Joash just didn't become who he needed to be regardless, despite of what he did. You know, you see that as well with today with parents and children. Sometimes parents do everything they can and they teach their children and they try to guide them and they grow up and they run the opposite direction. And other times they do what's right in spite of you not showing them what's right. So, I mean, you have both examples, and it just makes me wonder here if that came into play at all or not, or if it's simply Joash, a matter of him just kind of rebelling quickly after he's gone and following those that come in after.
Well, that's a good point. And I think one interesting thing on that note is we see right after Jehoiada dies, the princes of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and the king listened to him, and that's when they go astray. So I think right after Jehoiada dies, there's kind of this absence of influence, and the wrong people step into the power vacuum a little bit. But I guess we can close. There's a quote from Charles Spurgeon about Joash here. All that Joash had done was to give his heart to Jehoiada, not to Jehovah. It is very easy to be outwardly religious by giving your heart to your mother or your father or your aunt or your uncle or some good person who helps you to do what is right. You are doing all this out of love to them, which is at best but a very secondary motive. God says, "My son, give me thy heart." And so that's something that we see. Joash may have really, really been fond of Jehoiada, but that didn't get translated over to Jehoiada needs to be second and God needs to be first. Thank you all. Good class. We'll pick up here on Wednesday.